last night, we had about 125 students who joined with us in this room to begin to talk about the issues of race and identity, privilege, and social justice. It was a very powerful conversation to listen to the perspectives of the students as they reflected on their experiences as well as they reflected on the experiences of people that they know. And I'm very appreciative to Professor Yvette Cozier for leading that presentation last night. And it was a wonderful way of beginning to help prepare us for the conversation that we're having today about injustice, especially in the criminal justice system. Our next presenter is Dr. Nazgol Ghandnoosh. Dr. Ganoush is a research analyst at the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. She has written about the impact of racial perception of crime and about best practices for eliminating racial inequality in the criminal justice system. In addition to her writings, I also learned that Dr. Ganoush is and has been an advocate. When she was in Los Angeles, where she did her doctoral program, she contributed to the Ban the Box reform efforts to enhance employment prospects for people with criminal records, as well as participated in several campaigns to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions. Her work has been featured in several multimedia outlets. Dr. Ganoush has been both an outspoken critic as well as an observer of the criminal justice system. In one interview that I saw her, thank goodness for Google. In one interview I saw of Dr. Ganoush, she said that the solitary confinement is now hardwired into the architecture of America's prisons. What I discovered as I learned more about Dr. Ganoush is that she is someone who speaks out, and today she's here to speak to us. Please welcome Dr. Ganoush.
Hi, everyone. It's really an honor to be among the speakers here today, and thank you so much for coming. I was so moved by Cornell Brooks's speech earlier and learned so much from the panel earlier. And I think, maybe if you're like me, what's been really missing from the days so far has been some graphs and charts. And so I'm going to try to help with that and fill in that gap for you. So I guess I'm going to start with a quick question using these cards and ask you whether or not you think it's important to have race as an explicit component of criminal justice reform. So a green card would be yes, a red would be no, and I think this is, I want to quickly change my question to something else that I could say you've answered all yes to, so maybe yes, thank you. So my talk is going to be about identifying, trying to get at this question, whether and to what extent we need to think about race explicitly as we think about criminal justice reform. And I want to, when I get to some answer to that question, I'm going to show you what I see as the 4 sources of racial disparity created by the criminal justice system, and to give you some examples of very concrete reforms from around the country to address each of these sources of racial disparity. And the connection that I see here to public health, and you might see others, and I would love to hear your insights about this afterwards, is that some of what I'm going to be talking about will help to explain the deterioration of public health in the country in recent decades, and will help to explain the racial disparities that we see in health outcomes. But we'll also, I think, see some parallels and problems that occur within public health policy, and see how those kinds of problems play out within the criminal justice domain as well. So just to begin, to have a sense of the scale of the problem that we're talking about, this is the growth of the U.S. prison population. We're now at 1.5 million prisoners. This is not counting the population that's in jails. So adding those individuals would bring us to 2.2 million. So U.S. prison population and jail population has increased 7 times compared to the 1970s. So mass incarceration is a relatively new problem in this country. We didn't always have a rate of incarceration that was somewhere between 3 and 9 times higher than our peer countries. So I want to get right to the good news, in that in recent years there's been a shift, and part of that shift has to do with public opinion about criminal justice policy. So this is based on data that was prepared by Professor Mark Ramirez, and he put together survey data on how punitive people are when they're asked, do you support the death penalty? Do you support harsh criminal justice sentencing? Do you support aggressive policing? And what you can see is that there was an increase in punitive sentiment in the 1970s, and it peaked in the 90s, and it started to go down since the mid-90s. This actually maps pretty well, corresponds very well to crime rates. Crime rates went up in the 60s and 70s, and they've been going down dramatically since the 1990s. What this doesn't map to yet is the level of incarceration that we have in the country. So policymakers have some catching up to do with what the public supports in terms of criminal justice policies. So there has been some catching up. So President Obama has made it clear that criminal justice reform is a priority for him in his final months in office. Many of the leading presidential candidates have written about their support for at least modest reforms to the criminal justice system, and that's in the Solutions report on the right that was produced by the Brennan Center. There are coalitions now of organizations, like Coalition for Public Safety brings together organizations on the far right, such as Koch Industries, and on the left, such as the ACLU and many other organizations, to try to reduce the prison population. And then there's the Right on Crime organization, another one based in Texas, a conservative organization with signatories including Grover Norquist, and Newt Gingrich advocating for reducing the prison population in the United States. So this is a different era than we had been in for many decades, where we have leading policymakers advocating for scaling back the criminal justice system. We also have advocacy organizations proposing and working towards really significant changes. So these are all organizations that advocate for a 50% reduction in the prison population sometime between last year, and that deadline has already passed for one of them, and up till 2030. So the Cut 50 organization was organized by Van Jones. The ACLU is advocating for this within 8 years. Just Leadership, whose founder Glenn Martin is here, is advocating for this by 2030. Malta Justice Initiative is a Connecticut-based organization. 11 by 15 is a Wisconsin-based one. These are just some examples. So you saw the prison population chart that I showed you in the beginning, and there has not been a dramatic reduction in the overall number of prisoners, but there has been a dramatic reduction in certain states. So New York, New Jersey, and California have reduced their prison populations by over 25% in the last decade or so. This has been a period of time when crime rates have fallen in these states. Certain measures of crime have fallen at even greater rates than the rest of the country. During this same period of time, while crime rates have fallen across the country, many states have increased their prison population. So New York, New Jersey, California were able to achieve this not by tackling the issue of crime, but tackling the issue of problems in criminal justice policies, by reducing sentencing, by increasing rates of parole. So I just want to, this goes to show that when we look at the level of incarceration in our country, it's actually not closely related to rates of crime. It is closely related to the kinds of policies that we have in place. Another area of good news is the juvenile justice system. So this is something that I think there's not enough awareness about. The number of youth that are that are committed or detained has been cut in half in the last 10 years. And that's thanks to the work of a number of foundations like the Annie Casey Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, really educating policymakers and really effectively bringing down the number of arrests, diverting youth that are brought into the system so that they're not held in confinement if they're convicted. So this has been dramatic. So I want to ask you a question now about, based on the chart that I just showed you, so about a 50% reduction in the number of youth commitments. During this period of time that this has happened, do you think that the racial disparity in the juvenile justice system has stayed the same? Do you think that it's increased, or do you think that it's decreased? So red is increased, yellow stayed the same, and green is decreased. I thought that I would stump you, but you'd see where I'm going with this. And that's right. So one measure found that one study looking at about 5 jurisdictions across the country found that the level of racial disparity, the proportion of youth of color in the system has doubled during this period of time. So here we get to some tricky, a tricky issue, which is that the number of youth of color in the system has declined, and that's a significant achievement. But the proportion of youth of color relative to the proportion of white youth in the system has gotten worse. And so what I think that this shows is that when we think about criminal justice reform, we have to have an explicit goal of reducing racial disparities in the system. We can't just hope that this will come about by going after overall reforms that will affect everybody overall equally. Because sometimes the level of racial disparity, as we saw with the juvenile justice system, as I mentioned, actually can get worse when we bring about reforms that are not thinking specifically about reducing racial disparities. So to focus now on racial disparities, I just want to start with giving you an overall picture of what this looks like. African Americans and Latinos make up about 30% of the US population, but they make up about 60% of the US prison population. So this is how this breaks out in terms of the lifetime likelihood of going to prison. This is not even considering the likelihood of going to jail. This is the lifetime likelihood that a young person a teenager now born in 2001, will go to prison at some point in their lives in the US. For African American teenage boys right now, it's 1 in 3 will go to prison at some point in their lives. That's twice the rate as for Latino young boys, and it's young men, and it's 6 times as high as for white young men. And the racial disparities are similar for girls, for young women, but of course women are less likely to be incarcerated over the course of their lives than men. So what are the causes of this racial disproportionality in the prison system relative to the overall population? I think people sometimes go to one explanation or the other, but there are actually 2 factors that we need to think about. One of them is crime rates, and another factor is criminal justice policies. So to illustrate the point about crime rates, on the left is a chart showing you rates of homicide victimization. So what this shows is that in the last several decades, African Americans have been about 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide than whites in the US. So homicide is primarily an intraracial crime. People generally kill other people of the same race or ethnicity as them. And so that means that there is a higher rate of African American homicide offending compared to whites. And that has to do with the fact that African Americans are more likely to live in concentrated urban poverty than white Americans. Anybody that lived in those conditions, and you throw in easy access to guns into the mix, would have a higher rate of homicide offending and victimization. On the right-hand side is the complete other end of the criminal justice spectrum, perhaps one of the lowest level offenses, a marijuana arrest. And so what you can see there, and this is based on data from the ACLU, on the top it shows the disparity in rates of marijuana usage. So it's almost one-to-one. African Americans and whites use marijuana and many other drugs at very similar rates. But then a little bit lower down is the disparity in marijuana possession arrests. And African Americans are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites. So this is a clear example where it's not the difference in criminal activity that's driving the disparity in the criminal justice outcome, but it has to do with criminal justice policies and decision-making itself. So for many crimes, they fit somewhere in the middle. They have some component of differential rate of offending, and they have some component of bias and disparity in terms of criminal justice practice and enforcement. So now I'm going to talk about the four causes of racial disparity in the criminal justice system that are produced within the justice system. So this is sort of the right-hand side of the previous chart. I'll talk a little bit about differences in offending and criminal offending as well. But so the four causes of racial disparity produced within the justice system, the first one is racial bias in the use of discretion. I think this is the one that people think about most often. Biased police officers, biased judges, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. The second one is the disparate impact of criminal justice policies. So you can strip out the bias in individual decision-making, but we have laws on the books and policies in place that guide the work of criminal justice practitioners, and that these laws and policies have a disparate racial impact. The third one is policies and practices that disadvantage low-income individuals. So because people of color are disproportionately low-income in our country, they will be disproportionately affected by these policies and practices. And then the last one is policies that exacerbate socioeconomic inequalities. So I'll talk about each of these in turn and about reforms that try to tackle each one of them. So the first one, racial bias in the use of discretion. So on the left, am I showing you enough charts? Am I showing you too many? So on the left is a chart based on data from Charles Epp and colleagues. This is based on Kansas City traffic stops. And what they did was they distinguished between what they call traffic safety stops and investigatory stops. So traffic safety stops are stops that are things like moving violations, speeding, suspicion of DUI, where it's pretty obvious you're doing something wrong in your car that a police officer needs to pull you over for. Investigatory stops are a little bit more vague. They're considered more proactive policing, where the officer's pulling you over probably to investigate, to see if they can find some other some other crime. And so that includes things like driving too slowly, not signaling when you change lanes, no reason at all given for the stop. And so what they found was that in traffic safety stops, there's not a great deal of racial disparity in how often police officers stop people. So if you're speeding, you're speeding. And on the other hand, with investigatory stops, there is a great deal of racial disparity in how often officers are pulling people over. And they found the disparity happens across all ages. They also control for the value of the car. It happens across all car values. And so this is just looking at it for young people under the age of 25, and you can see the disparity for young men and young women in Kansas City, how often they were pulled over. And people find this in many jurisdictions when they do this kind of analysis on police stops. So this is something that happens in policing, but we also see biased use of discretion in the work of prosecutors, in the work of judges, and the work of other courtroom work groups, even juries, probation officers, and so on. And this, let me just say, what's going on here generally among criminal justice practitioners is not a matter of ill will, right? It's not generally going to be, people writing racist emails, acting on those overt racist beliefs. More often, it's people that want to do good work, but they have implicit biases that shape the decision-making, that make them more suspicious of people of color than of whites, and they're not aware that they're acting with those kinds of biases. So just a couple examples of reforms that try to tackle this problem. So Baltimore, Maryland, and a number of other jurisdictions are now very interested in having their officers undergo implicit bias training, so to help them better assess, in particular, when they should be using force, to better detect when their safety is at risk. So, when Cornell Brooks talks about reaching for his glasses and the officer reaches for his gun, that has to do with if a white person reaches for their glasses, it would be perceived a little bit differently, likely, by the officer, right? So even better than implicit bias training, which is very important, even better is to monitor the work of criminal justice professionals, give them feedback, and make them accountable. And so this is something that has happened to some extent in the Milwaukee prosecutor's office, where they worked with the Vera Justice Institute, and they looked at the rate at which they charged people with drug paraphernalia charges, and they found that they charged African Americans, so otherwise similar individuals coming into the system, they were 73% likely to charge African Americans, and 59% is likely to charge whites. And so by installing, setting up a system where they monitor these disparities and make themselves accountable for why these disparities happen, asking a supervisor to review the decision when it happens, they've been able to eliminate racial disparity on that particular charge. So the next issue, the next source of racial disparity in the justice system, so disparate racial impact of criminal justice policies. I think the most famous example here is the crack cocaine sentencing disparity, right? That was the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity that's now become 18-to-1. But another one, and I'm so glad that Mr. Hoffman talked about it earlier. I'm so glad that he's here today as well. So this is the drug-free school zone. So what you can see here on the left helps to visualize what he was describing. This is a map of the city of Indianapolis, and the drug-free school zones are drawn so that there are 1,000 feet of schools. So the yellow areas are areas where if you're caught selling drugs, you would get a sentencing enhancement. You would serve extra time because you're selling drugs near a school zone. So it sounds like a good idea, right? We don't want drugs near schools, near young children, but it ends up almost blanketing the entire city. And so what do we know about who lives in cities, and what do we know about who lives in suburban areas? If you're in the suburbs, it's much easier to sell drugs without being within a school zone, and you're more likely to be white. And so the impact of drug-free school zone laws is that they increase sentencing for the same behavior that people of color do in cities as whites do in suburbs and other areas. So another example of, well, I'm just for the interest of time, I think I won't go into the other, but there are other examples of laws and policies that are on the books that end up having this disparate impact that seem, just very briefly, for example, the 3 strikes laws that are around the country. Okay, so if you have a third conviction, you get an enhanced penalty. A lot of these laws, you get an enhanced penalty for a second conviction as well. Well, remember the chart that I showed you in the beginning, showing that people of color are more likely to be arrested, right? So that accounts for not just differences in criminal behavior, but it's also responding to differences in criminal justice enforcement. So these laws produce a disparate impact. Police policies, when we talk about disparities in policing outcomes, I think it's very important to not think that it just has to do with the decision-making of individual officers. So in an individual officer, I remember reading this story in the New York Times 12 years ago, and it was describing drug enforcement in Harlem, and the police officers in the story were saying, well, we're really not biased. We go to Harlem and we just arrest people that we suspect of selling drugs, and we're not looking at race. We're not singling out. Well, there are not a lot of white people at that time living in Harlem. You're not going, so I mean, you've selected a neighborhood, and that has to do with departmental policy of where the enforcement happens, right? So it's not just at the level of discretion, it's also at the level of policies that police officers follow. So stop and frisk policy in New York City, similarly broken windows policy, has a disproportionate impact on people of color. So examples of reforms to address these problems, so a number of jurisdictions have revised their drug-free school zones. So Indiana, for example, which I remember Indianapolis was pictured earlier, they have reduced their school zones from 1,000 to 500 feet. They've made it so that they don't fall into areas where there are housing projects. There's some requirement that the individual selling drugs would expect that there are students, young students around when they're selling drugs in order to mitigate the impact of that, the disparate impact of that policy. New York City, following litigation, significantly curbed its stop and frisk policy, and the city council now is considering legislation to reduce, to scale back broken windows policing as well. When is that? Oh, okay, good question. What is broken windows policing? Broken windows policing is the idea that it has a couple of different components, and the one component of it is that you ideally want to fix the broken windows in a community because by doing so, you'll help to prevent more serious crimes. So, you want to arrest people who are doing graffiti, who are, causing other kinds of small damage. You want to arrest people also like Eric Garner, who are selling cigarettes unlawfully on the street, because the idea is that when there's that level of disorder in a neighborhood, then that invites a greater level of violent crime. So it's something that criminologists understand, that there's actually very little relationship between that kind of minor enforcement and violent crime, but yet the gut instincts of a lot of police chiefs is that that relationship is there, despite the fact that there is not a lot of data to support it. And so it's been a very tenacious and difficult policy to scale back. So the third source of racial disparities has to do with the overlap between race and class in our country. So policies that disadvantage low-income people. So the picture there is of Khalif Browder, who was arrested at age 16 for stealing a backpack from somebody, and he was sent to Rikers Island. He was held there for 3 years, a really exceptionally long time before he was even charged, and finally the charges were released for him. And soon after his release, he committed suicide. During his time at Rikers, he was held in solitary for extensive periods of time. He experienced violence of the kind that Glenn Martin was talking about. One of the reason that he was held there for so long is that his bail amount was set for $3,000. Had he been able to post bail, he would have been released. His family couldn't afford to post bail, and so that's part of why he underwent what he did in that institution. So there's been an increased reliance on money bond in our country. The amount of money bond that's demanded for people to be released pre-trial has increased over time as well. And so people of color often end up staying incarcerated before they're adjudicated. This also leads to them accepting worse plea bargaining outcomes, plea bargaining deals just to be released. So long probation terms, where if they're caught violating probation, they're likely to get sent to prison or to jail. So these are, so that's one important source of this problem. And then another is the quality of indigent defense in our country. So if you can't afford to get good private counsel, the quality of representation that you get really varies dramatically depending on where you live. In some jurisdictions, it's great. If you're in Washington, D.C., you get a very well-funded public defender. If you're in New Orleans, you're in a jurisdiction where the public defenders have decided that they're going to stop accepting felony cases because of how serious their caseloads are and how little time they have to give adequate attention to their clients. So some examples of reforms to address these problems. So New Jersey last year reformed its bail system so that it moved away from a system of requiring money bond from everybody to be released to instead using a risk assessment instrument in order to determine whether or not somebody is likely to not return for adjudication, to determine whether or not they're a public safety risk or not in order to set their bail amounts. Berks County, Pennsylvania, reformed in their juvenile justice system. So they used to require that in order to avoid confinement, youth would need to be able to stay at home with their families. This is a problem for some youth who don't have stable families that they can safely return to. And so they invested in shelters for kids so that they would have an alternative, and if they don't have a safe home to go to, they wouldn't have to get incarcerated. So the last source of racial disparity in the justice system, lifelong punishment. So the top there is a question from a job application asking whether or not you've been convicted of an offense, of a criminal offense. Depending on how you answer this question, if you have a criminal record, if you decide to lie, when your employer finds out, they'll fire you because you lied on a job application. If you answer yes, chances are they won't look further on the job application. So making it very difficult for people after they have served their time to be able to get reintegrated into society. Really counterproductive if you think about what we're trying to achieve with releasing people back to communities after we're done punishing them. We really are not done punishing them. So we have these limitations in place for people to get employed. If they have a drug conviction, in many states around the country, people can't access public benefits, cash assistance, food stamps, they're barred. And this is a policy that, like I said, because of the overlap of of class and race, disproportionately affects people of color. And the last point that I want to make also is that related to this is how we decide to invest, we decide to invest limited resources to create public safety. I mean, we put so much money, $30,000 a year on average, to incarcerating people. So many more people are sent to prison now than in the past, for much longer than in the past. And as a consequence, we're underfunding prevention efforts. We're underfunding drug treatment efforts so that there are long wait lists for people when they are in the community to be able to access these things. And so I think this is also part of the puzzle to understand as well. So examples of reforms to address each of these problems. So there are a number of cities and states have now banned the box, at least for public sector hiring. Sometimes they're able to extend it as well to private sector hiring as well. Number of states have opted out of the ban on cash assistance and food stamps. So this is interesting because the federal government allows states to decide whether or not they want to restrict access to these public benefits. So states can, there's no cost to them to decide to give people access to these federal benefits. So there are a number of organizations are working around the country to encourage states to let people avail themselves of these federal benefits so that they can get back on their feet. And the last example is California's Proposition 47, which reclassified a number of offenses so that people wouldn't be convicted of felonies and sent to prison, and instead they would be convicted of misdemeanors and either sent to jail or given probation time. And what it also did was it specified that a large amount of the savings from this legislation would be transferred to crime prevention and drug treatment efforts. So this is the idea of justice reinvestment, that we want to scale back the criminal justice system and capture some of those savings to actually invest them in more effective public safety policies. Okay, so I just want to say a little bit more about the chart on the left here. I think I've said a little bit about this, but just to say just a few more points about it. So this is about the racial disparities in crime. And the problem here, I think, stems largely from issues beyond the criminal justice system. I think that criminal justice practitioners sometimes like to make that point and suggest that they have no role to play in fixing that disparity, when actually I think low-level arrests, the lifelong punishment issue contributes to these kinds of disparities in crime as well. But so the question is, what needs to happen here? What kind of policies, public policies, would we like to see to fix this disparity? And I think it's important to look to people who are most affected by crime to see what they think are effective crime policies. So this is a survey that was done using, this was from 2001, and it asked people, what do you think we need to do to reduce crime rates, to address the crime problem? Do we need more money for education and job training? Do we need more money for police and prisons? Or do we need to do both equally? And what you could see is that the green bar is African American respondents, the blue bar is white respondents. So remember, I showed you that African Americans are more likely than whites to be personally impacted by violent crime, right? So they're more likely to be directly impacted and victimized. And yet the majority of African Americans, 58%, said they want more money for education and job training. So this is not the direction that we've gone in public safety. We have instead followed more the responses of white respondents who are less likely to be personally victimized, who are very likely to say, well, they do say both, but a larger proportion will say more money for police and prisons than African Americans, but they'll say both, right? And unfortunately, policymakers generally hear the more money for police and prisons part are more responsive to that. So this is a report that, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can look into. And what we described in this report is the research that shows that white Americans who more strongly associate crime with people of color, so for whom crime is this other issue, are more likely to support punitive criminal justice policies. The problem with this is that we end up having a criminal justice system that's not just disparate, that's not just more harsh for people of color, that is true, but it actually ends up being more harsh for everybody going into the system, not for white Americans as well, as a result of the fact that a lot of policymakers, a lot of the public, when they think about the crime problem, they're not thinking about how they would address this problem if it affected them personally, if it affected their communities personally. And I think that's something that we need to encourage people to do, to think about what kinds of solutions would they come up with if they were more closely connected to the problem that they're trying to solve. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions. Someone's coming with the mic.
Thank you so much for your talk today. One thing that I was sort of pondering over as you were going through your slides was the privatization of our prison system in terms of thinking about policies, and that mass incarceration has become quite a lucrative business, and utilizing inmates to perform other sort of services unpaid. And I was wondering how that fits in as we're thinking about policy reform, and also in terms of thinking about the broken windows theory, how that in and of itself can be used as a vehicle gentrification.
Wow, those are great questions. So the first one about private prisons, I think that what the research suggests is that, so at this point, private prisons, they hold about less than 10% of the prison population overall. So, much of the problem that we have was not necessarily fueled by the sort of private profit motive, even though that motive and the organizations that represent the small number of private prison companies work really hard to maintain incarceration rates at their high levels, and they're branching out into other growth areas. Immigration detention, right? So their private prisons are a major part of the story. And they also are working on providing reentry services, providing drug treatment programs, and we can think about, if they're trying to, if they got the prisons and they've got the probation services that can send people back to prison, what are the mixed incentives there? But I do think that it's important to realize that the main problem that's gotten us here has been a political one. It hasn't been the profit motive, but it's been the incentives of elected officials and criminal justice practitioners, many of whom are elected, to respond to this sort of fear and not really evidence-based idea about how to promote public safety. On your second question about broken windows theory, it's such a good question, and I don't think that I have an answer for it. I think it's a very good point, and it's something to think about. I think that there's someone going to come with a mic to greet you. We'll come to you next. Yes.
So have there been any studies that look at the racial ethnic composition of the police force with respect to the racial ethnic disparities of the population?
Okay, that's a great question. So I think there have been some studies that look at this, and some suggest that, well, we know that aside from the results in terms of the degree of justice that racial disparity in criminal justice workforce produces, we need to have a criminal justice system that has practitioners that reflect the broader population, and that's not where we're at nationally. In terms of whether racial diversity is enough to address this problem, it's unfortunately not enough. And I think that part of the reason for that is that a lot of times diversity doesn't happen at the top level. So it'll happen among rank and file police officers, and it's not really up to them to decide to not enforce the policies of their departments. James Foreman, Jr., professor at Yale, law professor at Yale, is working on a book about Washington, D.C., and how is it that Washington, D.C. has had many of the same problems as the rest of the country, even though it's had quite a lot of racial diversity among its elected officials and among criminal justice practitioners. Okay, right here, yes.
Thank you. I was struck by the fact that you identified in your talk many policies that have not been found to be statistically related to the reduction in crime rate. Have you found any policies that are related to the reduction in crime rates that we've seen over the last 15 years?
That's a good question. Because I'm focused so much on criminal justice policies, I end up talking about policies that are not very effective in reducing crime rates. But I think that some programs that are effective, for example, include nurse-family partnership that connect women during the time of their pregnancy to prenatal care and services after they've had children, Head Start programs and similar early education programs. Some studies suggest that those kinds of things are effective. But I think, we can kind of also step back and think about, well, what are the communities that we see crime happening in? And part of the problem is that these are, hyper-segregated, low-income communities. We don't have the same kinds of problems as we see in those communities in more affluent, also segregated, but more affluent and privileged communities. And so, in some ways, I think that there's a lot of very fine-grained research that needs to get done to figure out what are the particular policies. But it also somehow seems very straightforward. Like we need to have not this level of disparity across the American landscape, where since there are so few opportunities for jobs, where educational disparity is so severe. So if we had an equality of opportunity, I think we wouldn't see this disparity in crime rates in communities. Yes.
Thank you. When discussing racial inequality in the criminal justice system, I want to know, why is it that the narrative of black women are overshadowed by that of black men? And just because according to the African American Policy Forum, people of color are more likely to interact with police and law enforcement, but women also have similar rates of interaction as black men do. So why is it that the narrative of the black woman is often lost?
I think it's a great point. I think one of the reasons that, so it's true that when you look at rates of incarceration, the rate of growth for women has been faster than for men. It's also true that with some areas, like for example, in school discipline, and when you look at racial disparities in how teachers discipline their students, how often they suspend them, how often they recommend for them to be arrested, the disparities, racial disparities among girls is more severe than among boys. But I think one of the reasons that I focus on men more than women and boys more than girls is because at the level of, at the point of arrests, at the point of incarceration, boys and men they have much higher rates of contact with the system than girls and women. But I think it's a very valid point that you make, that there's still significant disparities for women and that their stories are undertold.
Thank you so much. This has been really great to hear kind of the broad perspective. If we go back to broken windows, I know that public health's approach to broken windows has really been less focused on the crime and more about kind of the low-grade messages that an underfunded community that might have buildings and, that signal basically to its inhabitants that their neighborhood isn't cared for, that they are not prioritized. And we think about, in public health, what we can do to kind of ameliorate those messages. Is there anything, I think, within in the criminal justice system that is looking at the nuance, not so much the idea that that can lead to serious crime, but what does that do to the well-being and health of communities writ large, with policing as a piece of that community aspect?
So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer that, but I'll do my best. But well, one thing I wanted to say is that there has been some great research that distinguishes between broken windows policing defined as making arrests in order to address the broken windows problem, and broken windows policing defined as the police saying, do you want me to call somebody to fix this broken window? Do you want me to help you get access to, so police filling in more into the role of social workers and being more of community advocates rather than thinking that arrests are the way to deter and rehabilitate people from these problems. So I think that, and the research that's been done on broken windows policing, broadly defined, finds that that kind of service-oriented approach is effective at actually reducing crimes, whereas the arrest approach, there is much less evidence supporting that kind of policy. In terms of measuring outcomes other than violent crime, I'd have to look into that and maybe get back to you, but I think there's this sort of increasingly greater awareness and consciousness among police officers and chiefs that, in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement and the outrage that's happened around the country, that there needs to be a different relationship between police and the communities that they serve. So, for example, police officers, when Eric Holder was Attorney General, he described how he understood as a former, when he was a prosecutor, that when you had a police officer on the stand and the jurors had a very negative opinion of that officer, he could not secure a conviction that he thought was a very tight, legit conviction because of the frayed legitimacy of the police force in the minds of the people that were in the jury pool. So that's significant. Police officers also realize that in order to improve their clearance rates, they have very difficult time. They have very low clearance rates, so solving homicides and other kinds of crimes in communities, low-income communities of color, because a lot of people are not willing to talk to them. A lot of people are afraid of the consequences of talking to them, or just afraid of the consequences, not just from their community, but what's going to happen from the police officers themselves. And so they realize that they need to have a more cooperative relationship with the communities. And so there's been this shift among people that are sort of in leadership positions trying to redefine police work to get the police to think of themselves not as warriors against the communities that they're serving, but instead as guardians of those communities. So I think that's an important direction that things have been going in, but there's still, it does raise the question of how effectively, when we think about the police as sort of plugging in and filling in these other roles of mental health advocate, of social service provider, they ultimately carry a gun with them. And so, wouldn't it make more sense to actually send people in those professional positions to fulfill those roles rather than have police officers do this wide range of work that in some ways is a nice extension of their work, but there's always the threat that the gun will come out. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had a quick question. It's a broad question, actually, and I think it's a good ending point. So you mentioned, obviously, we're speaking about the criminal justice system here within the United States, but something that hasn't really been addressed is that the United States has the largest prison population in the world. We incarcerate approximately 25% of the world population. Louisiana has the highest prison population in the United States, and therefore the largest prison population in the world. So it's a United States problem, because if you look at our counterparts, 2.2 million people within both prisons and then jails, and that doesn't include individuals who are on probation, house arrest, parole, so on and so forth, and the intergenerational impact that it has. So what do you think, because it's a United States, it's within the foundation of this country, what do you think it is about the United States? Because other countries don't have this racial disparity. What is it about the fabric of the United States of America where we see, obviously, an exasperation of racial inequity, particularly within the criminal justice system, but all forms of our public institution, whether it's education, healthcare, housing, so on and so forth?
Thank you for these great comments and the question. So one thing that's different between the United States and other peer countries, especially at least during the 1970s and 80s when we developed these policies, is that we have a much more diverse country. So the issue of race and the issue of how people perceive problems, how white Americans perceive problems that they don't think of as their own problems, and the kinds of solutions that they come up with. Race really distorts the kinds of policies that we end up coming up with. But, and Louisiana is very interesting because when you look at the United States, we can talk about this as a national problem, but there's a lot of variation around the country. And places like in the South have some of the highest rates of incarceration, and they have some of the largest African-American populations as well, which I think helps to suggest that that race does play a major part in not just the problems that we have in terms of crime and inequality, but the quality of the solutions and the policies that we come up with. But you said that this is something that's been a foundation of this country, but actually, as I showed in the chart in the beginning of the rate of incarceration and the growth in the prison population, this is not a problem that we had from day one, the incarceration problem. Right? So this is sort of what Michelle Alexander describes as sort of a new manifestation of the race problem that we have. And so the hope is that we can undo this problem that we started to really, I mean, it's never been ideal, but it hasn't been at the point that it's at today. So we can undo this problem, and then the next challenge is to sort of weed it out in whatever other form it begins to take.